The wind carried a strange kind of ache the night the world brought Ayanna Redbird, age 22, and Nara Skyfeather, age 24, to the edge of Buck Holiday's, the giant cowboy's, cabin door, and even now I can still hear the hush of their footsteps drifting over the frost-hard ground like a memory that refuses to settle, as if it is still searching for the moment it first changed everything. Buck Holiday, age 30, stood with his hand at the latch, his silhouette outlined by the lantern glow that trembled against the storm-heavy dark, and though he had braved stampedes and dust storms and the fury of men who loved their prejudices more than their own children, somehow the sight of those two trembling women stopped him with a fear he could not name, leaving him caught between duty and something quieter, deeper, that tugged at the edges of his soul like a whispered reminder he wasn't ready to understand. Ayanna's voice barely rose above the wind when she murmured, "Just one night, please," her breath white against the cold, her dignity thinning but not breaking, while Nara stepped half a pace in front of her with a protective stillness that felt older than the land itself, though even her fierce calm quivered when the distant laughter of townsmen rolled across the empty dark like a threat they knew too well to ignore. Buck's fingers tightened, not on his gun, but on the wood of the doorframe, a hesitation that felt like a hinge between the man he had been and the man he feared he might never find the courage to be, and the longer he watched their shivering forms, the more the memory of the sheriff's voice pressed in. "If they come near your place, you turn them out, Holiday. No exceptions." A command that now tasted like glass in his throat. He stepped back instead of forward, making a space that neither woman immediately trusted, for safety had never opened itself gently to them before, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the air inside the cabin shifted as if holding its breath, unsure whether kindness could survive in a world that had so often punished it. The sense of pine smoke, saddle leather, and yesterday's stew wrapped around them, and for a heartbeat, Ayanna's eyes softened with something dangerously close to relief, though Nara kept her posture tight, poised to protect them both should this door close in a different, crueler way than the others had closed earlier that day. Buck handed them blankets without meeting their gaze, his large, work-scarred hands trembling in a way he hoped the dim lantern light might hide, and when Ayanna reached out to take the cup of water he offered, her fingers brushed his knuckles. Just barely, just enough, and something warm flickered in the cold space between them, surprising all three at once. Nara watched him closely, her dark eyes sharp with the wariness of someone who had learned to read danger even in men who smiled too easily, and though Buck offered no smile, there was a gentleness in the way he straightened the blankets around Ayanna's shoulders that forced her to reconsider her first judgment, leaving her curious despite herself. Outside, the wind shifted direction, rattling the loose boards along the porch as though the night itself had begun to sense the strange, fragile change forming inside that lonely cabin, a change too delicate to name and too persistent to ignore. When the fire burned low and their bones began to warm, Ayanna's voice drifted into the small space like a trembling thread as she spoke of the weeks behind them, villages that had turned them away out of fear, towns that had mocked their heritage, men who saw them as threats or burdens or worse, and though her words were quiet, each one struck Buck like a hammer against the guilt he carried but had never examined closely until now. Nara added her own truth, her voice steadier but no less worn, recalling the elders they lost to illness, the home they were forced to leave, and the desperate hope that Dustwalk Ridge might be different, though it had proven crueler than most places they had wandered through, a realization that pressed deeper into the cracks of Buck's chest with every quiet detail. Shame curled hot in Buck's stomach, for he had once laughed with the same townsfolk who tossed slurs like stones, and though he had never joined them in their worst acts, the memory of standing silent beside them felt like a stain he could no longer ignore as he watched these two women huddled by his fire, trying to rebuild a sense of safety with hands still shaking from the world's rejection. Ayanna hummed a soft melody then, an old lullaby her mother used to sing, and the sound wrapped around Buck like a warm shawl, the notes weaving into the cracks inside him with the steady tenderness of something ancient and grace-filled, leaving him wondering how a voice could sound both wounded and healing in the same breath. Their shadows flickered on the cabin wall, three shapes wavering together in the lantern light like a story just beginning to write itself, and Buck felt a strange pull toward those shifting silhouettes, as if they held a promise he didn't yet understand. Dawn arrived abruptly, carried on the stomp of angry boots climbing the cabin steps, and before Buck could fully stand, Sheriff Maddox Clay and half a ring of townspeople gathered outside, their faces tight with judgment, their hands hovering near their guns as though mercy itself were a threat needing to be stamped out. Ayanna flinched at the voices, and Nara moved with instinctive protectiveness, but Buck stepped in front of them, filling the doorway with his broad frame as Sheriff Maddox's voice grated through the morning chill. "Send them out, Holiday. Law's the law. Town don't want their kind hanging around." Buck felt the old version of himself tug at him. Obedient, silent, compliant, but the night had carved something new inside him, and instead of backing down, he raised his chin with a subtle defiance, though his pulse thudded hard enough to shake his breath. Maddox gave him an ultimatum: cast them out or lose everything he had built in Dustwalk Ridge, including his badge, his place, and the fragile respect that held his life together, and the weight of that threat pressed Buck into a moment that felt like a crossroads carved straight into his bones. When the sheriff finally rode off, promising to return by sundown, Buck returned to the cabin heavy with fear he didn't want the women to see, but the moment Ayanna offered to leave, to spare him punishment, the fear snapped into something sharp, protective, and strangely tender, leaving him unable to voice the truth gathering like a storm inside him. So he said the only words he trusted not to break. "If I marry you, they can't force you out. Either of you. You'll have my name, my protection, and my home." Silence fell like soft snow as Ayanna's breath hitched, and Nara's wary eyes scanned his face for any hint of deceit, finding none, only a man terrified not of commitment but of losing the chance to do something right for once in his life. Ayanna touched his hand first, gently as a falling leaf, while Nara gave the smallest nod imaginable, yet it carried the weight of a vow made out of trust rather than desperation, and that nod sealed a future none of them had dared to imagine hours before. The ceremony took place behind the cabin in a hush of wind and early light, with Reverend Amos Pike speaking the simple vows as the breeze swept through Ayanna's hair and Nara's steady gaze locked with Buck's in a moment of quiet understanding that stretched deeper than words. As Amos pronounced them bound, Ayanna's fingers lingered in Buck's palm with a warmth that chased away the morning chill, and Nara's tear, just one, slipped down her cheek, a rare offering of vulnerability she allowed only because the wind carried it away before anyone could decide what it meant. From that moment on, something steady began to root in the soil around them, and as days turned into weeks, the cabin shifted from a place of refuge to a place of belonging, its rough wood walls gathering new meaning with each gesture of care they exchanged. Ayanna decorated the kitchen shelf with beadwork patterns from her homeland, each one woven with symbols of gratitude and hope, while Buck carved new chairs with wide, gentle curves for the two women who had begun to guide him through the quiet spaces between words. Nara taught him how to track storms by listening to the tremble of the air, how to read distant dust trails, how to sit still long enough to feel the weight of the earth settling beneath his boots, and though Buck rarely spoke of it, the lessons felt like prayers carved into the rhythm of his days. Their bonds deepened not through confessions but through the soft intimacy of small acts. Ayanna brushing wood shavings from Buck's shoulders, Nara leaving a newly stitched leather band on his table, Buck warming a cup of coffee for each of them before sunrise, his clumsy tenderness becoming the language they slowly grew fluent in. Yet the world around them had not forgotten its cruelty, and as rumors spread, the townspeople grew restless, whispering that Buck's home had become a defiance the sheriff could not allow, until one night the sound of torches and shouts rose from the dark below like an old nightmare clawing its way into their fragile peace. Buck stepped outside before either woman could beg him not to, his shadow stretching long across the ground as Sheriff Maddox and his mob demanded the women be turned over, their eyes burning with fear disguised as righteousness, as though tearing apart a family could restore their fragile sense of order. Ayanna stood in the doorway behind Buck, her hand lightly touching the back of his coat in a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed, yet that simple touch steadied him more than any weapon could, while Nara moved to her side with a calm defiance that cast her in the torchlight like a warrior born of fire. Buck didn't draw his gun. Instead he spoke of dignity, of the simple right to live without being hunted, of the courage it took for two women to keep walking through doors that kept closing in their faces, and the words quieted the mob with a shame none of them wanted to feel but could no longer ignore. Sheriff Maddox, cornered by truth and pride, pulled his gun with a snarl, but before he could take a step forward, Nara met his gaze with a fearless clarity that cut deeper than any weapon, saying, "You fear us because you cannot own us," and the silence that followed broke the mob apart like brittle clay. When the sheriff rode off in humiliation and the last torch dimmed behind the ridge, the night finally exhaled, leaving only the three of them standing beneath a sky that seemed wider and more forgiving than it had an hour before, though the tremble of adrenaline lingered in their bones like a fading storm. At sunrise, they sat together on the porch, wrapped in a single blanket, watching the world warm into color as the long night retreated, and in that soft golden light, Buck rested his forehead gently against Ayana's and Nara's, speaking a promise shaped not by law or fear but by the steady, quiet devotion they had all earned through survival. "You asked for one night," he murmured, voice low with wonder, "but stay every night. Stay for all my days." And the wind carried his words into the brightening sky as though sealing them into the fabric of the morning itself. Their laughter rose with the sun, light, relieved, endless, and I wish I could tell you it faded with time, but some sounds carve themselves into the land and stay there, waiting for anyone who listens closely enough to hear what the world tried to cast out and what love chose to bring home instead. Because sometimes the longest journeys end at the door we were always meant to knock upon, the one that opens not out of fear but out of the quiet courage to say yes, even when the wind says no, and if you listen to Dustwalk Ridge at night, you might still hear that yes drifting across the plains like a promise that refuses to die.